the first two look at the emerging markets, and our next session is still going to look into the emerging markets in Africa, but with a flavor of WHO pre-qualification too. And that's going to be important, and you can see why. And it's a pleasure to have Robyn Meurant from NSF International. She is the Executive Director of the regulatory team at NSF. And she brings 30 years experience of regulatory experience. She started her career as a regulator back in Australia, in the Australian Therapeutics and Goods Administration. And then spent close to a decade in WHO and was instrumental in drafting of WHO PQ process. And then when we got in touch with her, for a good hour, we discussed what to focus here. So Robyn is going to talk about both the whole idea behind WHO pre-qualification process, and as you know, the medical device are already part of it. And then also touch upon the other markets in Africa, especially East Africa and South Africa. So please welcome Robyn. Robyn, thank you for joining us. It's over to you now.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you Satya and Ruth and everyone at Nesta for the kind invitation to come and talk, and really excited to be talking to your audience. I think it's a wonderful challenge, and it's a really hard challenge to bring, to come up with an innovative idea that can work and work well all the time. Just to correct one thing about my background, I actually didn't start as a regulator. I started with 20 years running large serology laboratories in Australia. So I'm old enough to have done a lot of things, and, and now it's well over 30 years of experience. So I'm with NSF now, and we're a not-for-profit public health organisation that is self-funded by we have regulatory services, and I'm someone who can offer regulatory advice if needed. Next slide, thank you. All right, I just want to focus on this because I think our last two speakers have given us a wonderful run into the complexity of medical devices and IVDs. And I must admit, I'm going to be mainly sticking to the subject of medical devices and IVDs because that's what I know. If I start to talk about medicines and vaccines, I will go way outside of my knowledge area. But that is a problem in itself when we talk about Africa, because as we've already heard, that and in many parts of the world, medical devices and IVDs are still regulated under medicines regulation, and yet they are by their nature very different. And I want to give a little bit of background to regulation as we go through this talk and why things have emerged the way they have, I guess. Now, usually the regulation of devices, and I'll use the word devices to capture medical devices, has sort of evolved from medicines because of the complexity and the variety that we have in medical devices. We don't just talk about GMP with devices. We talk about ISO, as we've heard from our last speaker, ISO 13485, because it really looks at, it's a more principle-based quality systems method that really means that you apply it to your unique medical device. And with medical devices, we have an enormous range of technologies. We have from everything from a condom to a heart valve to sophisticated software. And what differentiates these from a drug or a medicine? And it's because medical devices, the main mode of action is not pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic. If it was, it would make it a medicine, a vaccine, or a biological. And so it's the mode of action that separates medical devices from biologicals and medicines. We do have combination products, as this little diagram shows us. So that might be a drug-eluting stent. And in that case, usually in mature regulatory bodies, they're usually regulated, such a device would be regulated by both the medical device regulator as well as the medicines regulator. But I wanted to show you this first to bring your attention to this interrelationship. And And as I said, we can see from this diagram, IVDs are a subset, and they're a subset because they fulfill the basic definition of a medical device. But what differentiates them is that the manufacturer intends them to be used in vitro for the examination of the specimens. And so I think it's good to keep this picture in mind when we think about regulation, because, and especially in emerging markets, and especially in emerging markets where the regulator is still new at regulating and still may not understand the nuances between medical devices and medicines and the importance for the differences in the regulation. Can I have the next slide, please? So I asked Satya if it would be okay if I could diverge from his initial topic of talking about 3 of the countries within Africa and actually bring to you some of the activities that WHO has been doing. And I think if you're going to be operating in Africa, it's really, and in a lot of low and middle income countries, it's really important to understand the activities and what's happening from a WHO perspective. Next slide, please. Now this might remind you a bit of some of the COVID heat maps we've seen, but this was a 2016 survey of regulation of medical devices in member states that WHO undertook. And here you can see it's quite obvious that Africa, the continent, had some of the poorest regulation of devices in general. And actually the survey revealed that only about 2/3 of member states had any regulation in any form of regulation of medical devices, and only about half of these regulated IVDs or diagnostic tests in any way. Next slide. But as you can see from this slide, another survey in 2018 showed that on the continent, there are various regulation is effective in or parts of regulation are effective. About half the countries have some sort of importing license or control. So countries do not want to know what's on their markets. So that's one of the simplest things they can do is have a license for supply. About half of them have registration procedures, and many of them have post-market surveillance. So that's just to give you an idea about this. Next slide, please. But anyway, further from this, the surveys that had happened, it became very apparent to WHO that for medical devices, the systems were far less advanced than they were for vaccines or medicines. It's for most low and middle income countries. In fact, most member states do have something in place for medicines, regardless whether we consider it effective or not. And as I said, a much smaller percentage had anything to do with devices. There is generally a lack of awareness and a lack of understanding the characteristics of medical devices as a product group. And therefore, there's still this tendency in some countries to regulate them under a medicines type regulatory scheme, which doesn't really fit. And it's also hard for countries wanting to take up regulation to start regulating in an existing market. And there's certainly a lack of specialized knowledge and resources to draft and implement medical device regulations, and a general lack of resources all in all. Next slide, please. So the World Health Assembly had a mandate and called upon the Director General of WHO to prioritize the regulation of medical devices, including diagnostics. But another very important part of this mandate was to support the building up of effective national and regional regulatory bodies and networks. And this is important, because we've already said there's not enough capacity, and knowledge. So it's going to be very important for regions to think about having a regional network, a regulatory body. As we've already had one question on that today about the MENA states. Next slide, please. So out of all this survey and work evolved a book which provides a framework for the introduction of regulation of medical devices, which includes IVDs. And if they wanted to address in creating this book, how do you begin regulating? What do you regulate? How to regulate and when to regulate, the priorities and the settings. The model outlines a general approach, but does not pretend to even provide country-specific guidance. Next slide, please. I wanted to mention there that this guidance created by WHO was actually put together by a lot of regulatory experts from all over the world, as well as regulators from low and middle income countries who could bring to the table the realities of trying to introduce this type of regulation when there isn't a lot of capacity or funding behind it. So we can see from this slide that part of this framework, there's a big emphasis on definitions, risk classes, and essential principles. And we've already heard from our last speaker a little bit about the essential principles, a bit about risk classes and definitions. And one thing that is really important is that you harmonize these with international best practice. If a country changes the definition of what is a medical device or what is an in vitro diagnostic test, then that means that they cannot, there's going to be differences in how something is regulated, and that just causes barriers, and that's always a problem. In putting the framework together, there was a realization that you couldn't expect every regulatory authority to be like the US FDA immediately. It needed a stepwise approach. And certainly it was important that there should be the opportunity for convergence and harmonization and collaboration. Also, this framework tries to attempt to deliver a framework that is sustainable and expandable and can accommodate advances in clinical practices. Next slide, please. At the heart of this framework, the model, is the importance of product risk setting the level of control that you take as a regulator. So if a product has low risk to the patient or public health, then don't put a lot of effort into that. If it has high risk, that's where the regulator should put their requirement. So next step, please. Oh, and I've forgotten a very important thing to tell you. We've already heard from others and myself that, you know, there are still countries that regulate devices under the medicines regulator. One of the problems too, for a lot of the countries trying to bring in regulation of devices, is that many of the staff are mainly pharmacists. Now, pharmacists have my great respect. They're highly intelligent people, but they may not understand the nuances of devices. So that's just another struggle that I wanted to mention. And you need to be aware, because if you run into problems when you're trying to bring a product through the regulatory pathway of a country, it may be that they're just not really understanding devices and what they are and how they work. So the two-step approach was a country needs to assess at what level they are, and if they should be able to reach a basic level of controls before they try to do anything more sophisticated. And these basic levels include establishing a legal framework that includes the definitions, includes the essential principles, includes classification, includes requirements for manufacturing under quality systems, includes requirements for labelings and things like this. It should provide market oversight, so knowing what comes into your country. That's one of the first steps, and Tanzania, that was the very first step Tanzania took as a regulator. They started a listing of medical devices, and South Africa did the same thing too. And so it's a very wise way to make sure you know what's in your country first, and then you can start to do something about it. And also start to put in some basic post-market controls. Next slide, please. So then once you've reached that stage, you can move on to the expanded level of controls. And this is when you might be having oversight of clinical trials, having electronic submissions of dossiers, performing your own audits, and other more sophisticated aspects too. So it provides all the framework for doing that. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, a big part of this document is the need for you to have legal systems, have the possibility to utilize regulatory reliance and recognition mechanisms. And we've already heard today from our last speakers how India and the MENA countries generally will accept products that have had regulatory approval from other non-regulators. And so that's what we're talking about. Next page, please. Next slide. And so this framework is built on pushing for convergence and harmonization. Every time a country decides to do something country specific, they make it harder for good products to get to market, basically. But I have to tell you, the 3 countries I'm going to talk to you about have generally accepted this model and are really working towards being able to make the most of reliance and recognition. It's more reliance mechanisms. Next slide, please. Now, another thing that WHO has done, as I said, cooperation is a big part of this. So we've now seen the creation of the African Medical Device Forum, where implementation of this global medical model framework is very much part of the thrust of this. It was previously known as the Pan-African Harmonization Working Party. We also see efforts on the subcontinent with the EAC trying to harmonize medical device regulation and trying to do it so that there's approval in one country can be reflected or acknowledged by another EAC state. And this is, we also see extension of the work of the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative. Medicines always lead the way, but in fact, I think people, especially with COVID, are realizing the importance of devices. Next page, please. And I'm going to have to speed it up a bit because we'll never get through. I would need to talk to you about WHO prequalification, because even though WHO is not a regulator, prequalification is a regulatory-like process. You can go to the next slide, please. And the trouble with PQ, it has a limited scope. The scope of products it will assess is limited to those that the programs within WHO see are priority. Now you can see the list here, and certainly you could say that cholera, syphilis maybe have something to do with AMR, because if they're not treated properly, you'll have resistance. However, there is a possibility to get other products within the scope of pre-qualification. And why it's important that you know about PQ is that on the African subcontinent, WHO and pre-qualification are seen as important, very important parts to have in your consideration. If you have, for instance, an HIV test and you haven't had it pre-qualified, it's very unlikely a country will think to adopt it. So next slide, please. Okay, and so the findings of PQ, this assessment, generate an independent technical information that countries and member states and UN agencies use. In fact, it very much guides the spending of all UN funding. Next slide, please. And what it is composed of is 3 components: a review of a product dossier, and I was in charge of that part when I was at WHO, and one of our other speakers, my dear colleague and friend Sally Hoivat, was a product dossier and reviewer, and I think still is for WHO. They do an independent performance evaluation to verify any performance claims you, the manufacturer, may take, and they do a manufacturing site inspection aligned with ISO 13485. Next slide, please. So it is very similar to a regulatory review, and it's aligned with all best international practice, but it actually, what is the value of PQ for countries that it serves is that it actually takes into account aspects relevant to resource limited settings. So, and this is a really important thing. It will look at labeling very carefully to make sure that it's very clear, taking into account perhaps the educational level of the user and whoever may need it. It will look at whether interfering substances, for example, for an IVD, take into account what will be encountered when it's used in Africa, not when it's used in Europe. And that's why it's a bit different. Next slide, please. Now, I want to give you this slide for you to take. This is probably one of the most important slides. If you're making an IVD, The guidance that WHO has created is free. It is based on all the ISO standards and CLSI standards, and it is really pragmatic and will help you deliver a product that really can work well in these resource limited settings. Next slide, please. I also want to tell you quickly about the Global Fund has a similar assessment process, but it's really been produced for innovative products. And it's a slimmed down version of PQ, and it's created because Global Fund a lot of the medical products that are supplied in many parts of the world. Next slide, please. I will just go through the next few slides pretty quickly. But if you are going, for a country to use Global Fund money, they must only buy products that are either pre-qualified by WHO, recommended by WHO TB program, have got stringent regulatory assessment, or have gone through the expert review panel for diagnostics, the ERPD. The thing with the next slide, please. So ERPD is a Global Fund may get a request and say that looks like there's some really innovative products coming for AMR, and none of them have got any stringent regulatory oversight yet, but we think a WHO might say, or a member state might say, we really think this product's going to be a game changer in our country. And so Global Fund will set up a ERPD and will open it up to all manufacturers, let's say for AMR, and will do a review similar to PQ, but they don't do an on-site inspection. They'll do a desktop review of findings. They will look at the evidence you have of performance, and they don't do a performance evaluation, but they will look at it and they will decide whether there is sufficient evidence, and it doesn't have to have met full regulatory approval, sufficient evidence for that product to receive ERPD approval for a limited period, maybe 1 year. In that year, you are meant to try and get your books in order and that product in order so it can meet full stringent regulatory assessment, or also that it can be pre-qualified. Next slide, please. And here's the process. So, and WHO assists in this. It sort of coordinates a lot of the activities for the Global Fund. So both PQ and ERPD are very important mechanisms to be aware of. They're not regulatory, but they're based on that. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, now I'm actually going to do everyone a favor, and the one thing I'll say about these three countries is they are following the stepwise approach. All of them need a local representative. All of them are some of them, for instance, Tanzania has been adopting this WHO framework and a stepwise approach for a longer time than the others. But all three countries are really beginning to demonstrate some real basic maturity, if not meeting more than the basic requirements. And I have some information. I'm not going to go into the detail for each country that our last two speakers do, because I just don't have the time, but I'll give you a little flavor of the regulation in each one. And I can, if you want more details, I can help you after, and my email address is on the back. But I think it's more important that you understand that these three countries really have taken to heart this framework I was talking to you about, which I suggest you look up and read, and then it'll help you understand what's doing. Next slide, please. We'll start with South Africa. The regulatory agency is the South African Health Products Regulatory Agency, also known as SAPRA, and they started to regulate IVDs and medical devices as a separate entity from medicines in 2016, following the WHO advice. Please, next slide, please. And this just shows you some of the, I'm not going to read to you the regulations, but as you can see, many of the things that I've already talked about, they've started to adopt. But they didn't start doing highly sophisticated regulatory activities, and they're still not doing them all. They started with knowing what's in their country, and they are now at the, so next slide, please. And they require you, if you're a manufacturer, an importer, or exporter, or a distributor, to have a license, and you need an authorized representative for that. For Class A products, you don't have to, as long as they have an establishment license, that's all that is needed. But if you have so Class A being the lowest risk products for devices or IVDs, Class B, C, and D devices need to have an approval given by SAPRA. And as you will see here, again, it's a risk-based approach. Class B, which is not such a high risk, a free sale certificate. Class C and D, you can, if you have it, submit a proof of approval from a stringent regulator, or you can also provide WHO prequalification, but you still must hold a copy of the technical file. And you need to have, so with that, you have at the moment, there's a declaration that the essential elements of quality system are in place, but this will change in the next few years. Next slide, please. Tanzania. So the regulator there used to be called TFDA, but now has changed its name, and I love this. Tanzania Medicines and Medical Devices Authority. It's really putting medical devices on the front page, and I think that's great. They have, because they were one of the first to really try and create a stepwise approach, even before the WHO guidance was out, you will notice that some of the definitions do not follow 100% those that are internationally recognized. This may cause some problems or it may not. You need to be aware of that. The regulation, as actually I think it does in South Africa, also covers donations. Now, you may be asked if you manufacture something to donate, or someone may offer to donate your products there. But be aware that does not mean you can avoid regulatory oversight, and you shouldn't. Next slide, please. So all medical devices must be registered. All importation must be done by importers whose premises are fully registered, and all importers must import through some authorized ports of entry in Tanzania. So that's, and there's still, all of these are listed. Next slide, please. So here we see that Class A's are exempted, but there are a number of requirements, but if you are Japan model, if a medical device has been approved by an IMDRF member countries or pre-qualified by WHO, if you must provide your dossier, product dossier, but if you provide evidence of approval by one of these entities, the whole approval process will be fast-tracked. Next slide, please. There is also the fact that TFDA has the right to sample imported devices for further investigation. And there are some products they routinely sample once they come into the central stores. And this may take some time for release. Thank you. Next slide. Let's go to Kenya. And it's the Pharmacy and Poisons Board. It is the national regulator. And they have now an act which includes medical devices as a separate entity to medicines. Thank you. Next slide. And it has followed the stepwise approach, and many of the requirements are internationally harmonized. So I'm not giving you any of the detail here, but just telling you it's going to be an easier path than places where it's not. All of these three countries do this. Next slide, please. You need, I've said this already, you do classification of your products, and Class A's and B products undergo a listing procedure, whereas Classes C and D undergo a registration procedure. That's the main message from this slide. Next slide, please. If you need the registration, there are 3 routes applicable. And just to let you know that if to profit from the abridged or expedited evaluation route, it's based on having evidence that you have, your product has been undergone regulatory approval in an IMDRF country or WHO. Next slide, please. So these are the places where they will accept a fast-track registration from. Next slide. This is my last slide. Second last slide, but I found this in my research, and it was some McKinsey research back in 2013, and it says what it takes to win in Africa with medical products. And I thought there were some lessons here that I'm not going to say, I think theirs was more from a marketing point of view, but I want to bring it to from a regulatory point of view, and actually a point of view of bringing good products, your product, to a market in Africa if it's going to make a difference. The first point, tailoring products to meet local needs. They suggest to create a broad offering. And I think this is really important because it's very difficult. You may have a wonderful solution which needs an instrument, but you only have one, it's only meeting one need. That's going to be really hard for these countries which are resource strapped to justify. So think about having a portfolio. End-to-end solutions. McKinsey recommends to build turnkey disease solutions and fully integrated supply chain solutions. If COVID has taught us anything, it's the fragility of the supply chain. And I do know at the moment that WHO is looking for people who can, for solutions that are end-to-end solutions. And this really helps a country if you can provide the end-to-end solution, having everything available. The third point, I didn't have any thing to say to, but invest in creating the market and generating sales. I want to say to that use. So my advice here is to make your product something that they want, not what you think they want. Really, there can be a big difference. Really get to know your market. And I have some, if you ever want to learn more about how to make sure you do that from design downwards, I'm very happy to talk to you. The next point, create strong tactical partnerships. When you're developing your product, there are some trusted providers on the continent that can help you. And I also highly recommend that you think of contacting groups such as PATH or FIND for your clinical trials. These groups certainly know the lie of the land. They also have great relationships. Many of the universities within on the African continent, and I can think of WITS for one, there's many groups who partnering them will help. They really do know the local needs. And we have, you know, I think it's a great way if you can think of bringing it together as a regional approach. And we saw this when HIV quantitative viral load testing was introduced to the continent. And there really was many of the players, actors, ministries of health, aid organizations, NGOs, Pathfind, there were many who came together and helped bring that, so that it was a very efficient way to bring a new product to market or new type of product to market. And it made a big difference. And it also meant collectively there was a lot of evidence that you need for regulatory approval that was very specific to Africa that was generated. And that certainly made it much easier for pre-qualification when we reviewed these products. We saw that the evidence really was on the ground evidence that about the products actually working in the context where it will be used. So thank you. I wish you all the best. One more slide. I've got one. I'll keep going through the next two slides. Here we are. The important thing, regulatory landscape is changing constantly. The good news is there's a great push for a harmonized approach. And I do recommend seeking approval by a stringent NRA or WHO to facilitate market entry. Last slide. It's been next slide is my last slide. And thank you very much. It's been great to talk to you, and I really look forward to your questions.
Robyn, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, combining both the PQ as well as the African market and really underlining the need for that. But having said that, there have been a couple of questions, and maybe I should start with the one coming from Anirudh Atre. And Anirudh, if you're still there, yeah, he's still there. He is asking, does WHO PQ consider devices other than communicable diseases like cardiac critical care, such as defibrillators? Is it part of the list? So, adding to that question was my question. You showed the list, but do you think the list is going to be expanded to include defibrillators and other products?
At the moment, it certainly hasn't. And this is a question. Now, I have to tell you that pre-qualification is entirely supported by the Gates Foundation and Oh my goodness, it's on the tip of my tongue. I should know, I can't think. Sorry, it'll come to me 5 minutes after the talk. And they decide more or less. So, but it is generated by the needs of the programs. Now, in fact, PQDX, pre-qualification for diagnostics, has one medical device that it assesses, and that's male circumcision devices, because that assists the HIV that's used for HIV prevention. So I think the way to do it is, if things like defibrillators, these are really important. The way to do it is talk to the programs in WHO and say, can we get some sort of pre-qualification program growing for this? And it's a bit of a lobbying, and I've often done that. The other way is, and this is why I thought it was important to mention the Global Fund Expert Review Panel, because this provides another mechanism for an assessment that gives you a nod with the UN agencies that is a bit more agile than PQ. PQ is like a big wheel that's very hard to push around. It doesn't move fast by its nature, whereas ERPD is meant to be more agile. And please feel free to talk to me afterwards if you're interested in how you can go about lobbying to make something like that happen. And it has to be a lobbying. But one point here is, make sure you get a member state on board with you. If, let's say, you're working with Tanzania and they've said, I need defibrillators, and we're just not assessed, we just haven't got enough information on them, get a member state on side. That's the first trick. And then I can tell you how we can go about it from there.
Brilliant, thank you. Any other query before? Ruth, do you see any other questions in the chat? No. Okay, then let me, maybe ask one last question, Robyn, now that we have you on board. So, if I am a developer in the emerging market, or even in the US, and I have gotten all the quality management system benchmarked and certified by the ISO, by the CE, ISO 13485, all of that. Even if I have done that, you are still going to recommend to go for WHOPQ to enter these markets? That's one question. And if I do, what's the cost of it?
Okay, right. So if you can go through PQ, I definitely recommend it for a couple of reasons. I think there's a lot of faith on the continent of WHO advice. And this is what PQ generates. It generates advice. So that's one thing. And a lot of countries don't want to do things out of step of what WHO says. So that's one point. The other point on why
on the cost of it.
Oh, the cost. Yes, sorry. I have got it here, and if you just give me 1 minute, it's actually much cheaper than most other regulatory procedures. It does come with an annual fee, but I'll just pull this up for you.
I mean, if you can give us a ballpark figure, that's also fine.
Yes. Here it is. There is if you don't already have some sort of stringent regulatory approval already, then you have to pay the full pre-qualification fee of $17,000 US. And there is an annual fee of $4,000 US per product. So, but if you can go through the abridged way where you have some evidence that it's been assessed by the FDA or whatever, there's rules around that, then it's $8,000 for the abridged fee. So. And
so, if you're talking about close to 15 to 17 grand US dollars, and the kind of funding the startups have, across the world, and it's not just startups in India, even if you look at startups in the West Coast or East Coast or even in middle of Europe, that extra cost, maybe, it's close to $15,000 to $17,000. That's quite substantial.
Yes. Sure.
Do agencies like Gates and others actually subsidize part of this? Have you come across where there are agencies that could be subsidizing part of the WHO PQ for this startup?
I do know that some do, like PATH, I think maybe FIND. There are some that definitely do. If they, like PATH and FIND, if they believe in your product and believe it's going to make a difference, they will assist you certainly along the way. That's in many different ways.
Right, and I was part of a funding agency in India, and I still think, in our budget heads, we never had WHOPQ as part, or when we had things like maybe for QMS systems and ISO and CE certification. And I wonder, Daniel, from your vantage point, do you think funding agency in the UK possibly have money to subsidize companies if they want to go into WHOPQ?
I think there's a couple of issues here. One is, so far, we have not been very successful, as Robyn says, lobbying collectively the AMR community. And of course, I know there are medtechs participating here that are working on other types of products, but since Longitude Prize is focused on the diagnostic in AMR, so far it's a bit out of the system. Unitaid is starting to look at it a bit, but so far Global Fund wouldn't support these type of tests unless they were connected to the 3 big diseases. Mm-hmm. So that's really the first thing that we have to do. The issue is, the big barrier today is not the cost of pre-qualification, it's the fact that these products are not on the list as being eligible to be pre-qualified.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is very true. I'm very happy to help with any lobbying on that if you need. I know, because I've been on the inside. And of course it's Unitaid who are the other sponsors of PQ. So it's Gates and Unitaid. It's a shame. I mean, Global Fund, the expert review panel is free. You don't have to pay for that. It's a time limited assessment, but it's good. But I do think, certainly we can talk about this offline, but if we can, it is important to get it on the list somehow, and on a list, and so that there is that recognition, because I do think that going through some sort of WHO assessment really opens the doors.
So if we take Anirudh's example, and we still have a couple of more minutes, so I just wanted to dig into this a bit. And if, I know the startups in India, they have a defibrillator that is ISO 13485 certified and all of that. So when you talk about lobbying and going to WHO to put that on the list, what would be a couple of simple steps for startups globally to do that? I mean, if you could say, these are the 3 things you should do, like, what's the starter gun for, what's the step 1 for that?
I think step 1 is to find out which department you can talk to within WHO it's most relevant to, or if it's like a lot of medical devices are essential devices for many programs. You can't, a stethoscope, for instance, it's underpins, it's the basic dressing of the doctor, so I think it's about getting some lobbying. I don't like the word lobbying. It sounds too political, but the trouble is.
Let's call it advocacy.
Yes, and thank you, much nicer word. And so getting the programs on board, getting some member states behind you, like I say, that's very much part of the story. And then it's about going to the program area, to PQ, getting your program area that you've brought on board to help you go to PQ. Now, unfortunately, it's not just PQ who makes this decision. Because they're supported by external funding agents, those external agencies have say in what happens. And one is, I know, is more flexible than the other. So I would be talking to Unitaid, I'd be talking to Gates and just saying, look, we need this. And it is about really stressing that I think everyone knows the cost of quality. Everyone talks about the cost of quality. No one because it's too hard, talks about the cost of no quality. And no one tries to define it. We tried to define it when I was the regulator in Australia, the cost of a wrong HIV result in Australia. And it was something like $65,000 for retesting and everything like that. Trying to put a figure on, if you don't have that quality assurance, what's the cost ultimately? The device is just part of the story. It's a whole testing procedure. It's what happens, you know, if we are letting through, if we're encouraging antimicrobial resistance, the cost of that, that's what we're talking about. And give it in hard figures. Figures count, money, you know, money counts still. So it does become lobbying in a way, but it's advocacy. Right. We're going to be advocates, absolutely.
So the simple answer, Anirudh, is, and others, you know, whether it's Amrita or Manoj from NemoCare and many others, is to maybe start involving ICMR, Indian Council of Medical Research, you know, and let them know about trying to then kind of, you know, corral some forces to start lobbying for it. Okay. Any other queries before we go to the next session? I'll give 10 more seconds. If anybody wants to raise a hand. Daniel, Ruth, or maybe I can quickly, still have for 1 minute. You know, Robyn, you mentioned about you know, engaging with FIND and PATH, and we have Peter Daly from FIND and as well as from Berkeley. Peter, would you like to give a comment on whether startups can approach FIND and then the whole WHO PQ process, you could be helping them if you're still around?
I'm still around. Just need to unmute there. Yes, that's an excellent idea. Both PATH and FIND are good resources, particularly in infectious disease, for companies, startups to connect with and to get advice.
Thank you, Peter. And
great scientists in both organizations to help.
Right. And as Robyn said, good knowledge, and it'll vary between different organizations in terms of what particular infectious disease dealing with. But most of the focus is on infectious disease.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter, for that. Okay, we'll move on. Robyn, thank you so much. Fantastic talk, lots of information, lots of direction and pointers to our attendees. So on behalf of everyone, thank you once again.
It's a pleasure, a real pleasure.